The mic crackled as my son took the stage, the same son who once whispered, "You embarrass me." Still, I sat in the third row, smoothing the creases from the dress I wore to his first recital. As they announced the first name, mine, the silence in his eyes grew louder than applause. While flashbulbs fired for him, my name lingered on the screen, bold and lit. The same voice that once hushed me now had nothing left to say. That's when I knew. I didn't raise him to clap. I raised him to witness. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Lena spotted Noah across the crowded senior breakfast, his back stiff, eyes scanning the room with an unease that only a mother could catch. She raised her hand, a simple wave, a small gesture. It was a familiar one she'd made thousands of times since his first steps, his first words, his first scraped knee. But today, it seemed to carry more weight than it ever had before. Noah flinched, just slightly, before his gaze darted toward her. He hesitated, his chest rising with a slow, steadying breath, as though he were bracing for something more than just the sight of his mother. She could feel it, how every inch of him tried to shrink away, tried to fit into a version of himself that didn't have room for her. "Please don't," he muttered, loud enough for only her to hear. "You embarrass me." The words hit her like an unexpected gust of wind, sharp and cold. For a moment, everything around them blurred, the chatter of classmates, the hum of the coffee machine, the clinking of cutlery. All that existed was him, standing there, mouth open, the words lingering like a weight neither of them could shake off. Lena didn't respond immediately. She didn't have to. His words were an unspoken truth between them now, a truth she had never wanted to face. She nodded, her eyes steady, but the smile she offered was more of a thin line than anything resembling warmth. And then, without another word, she turned and walked away. Camille, standing nearby, froze in her place. Her eyes flickered between Lena and Noah, the shock of the moment settling like a stone in her stomach. But Lena didn't look back. She kept walking. Her pace measured, her heart now beating to the rhythm of a different kind of ache. Later that afternoon, Lena sat at the kitchen table, folding Noah's laundry with a quiet deliberateness, as though each fold somehow calmed the storm inside her. The fabric felt heavier than usual. His shirts, his jeans, his socks, all reminders of the boy she had raised, the boy who was becoming someone she barely recognized. Her back ached from the constant motion, the effort of the last few years pulling on her bones like a silent weight, a burden only mothers like her would understand. She wasn't just folding clothes, she was folding the life she had built for him, piece by piece, hoping each wrinkle would smooth itself out, hoping the love she poured into him would somehow shape him into the man she had dreamed he would become. A knock at the door broke the silence, and she didn't need to look up to know it was Mel, her best friend, her co-worker, Lena's unwavering support in the cafeteria. Mel had always been straightforward, never one for empty words or sugarcoating things. "Raise a tree straight. Sometimes it still bends," Mel said softly, stepping into the kitchen with the same directness she always brought. But this time, there was a softness in her voice that made Lena's chest tighten. Mel had seen too many of Lena's sacrifices to not understand the sting of what Noah had just said. Lena opened the drawer labeled School Docs, the label frayed at the edges from years of use. She reached in, her fingers brushing over the familiar papers, the bills, the receipts, the records of everything she had done, everything she had given up, for this moment. She pulled out a thick envelope, its edges creased from constant handling. Agreement. Sunridge. The words on the envelope were a cold reminder of how far she'd gone to give him what she had never had. A future without limits. A chance for him to step beyond the world that had always boxed her in. She didn't open it. Not yet. But she couldn't ignore the pull it had on her, the weight of everything it represented. She had signed her name so many times, but today, it felt like a final agreement she wasn't sure she wanted to be bound to anymore. Lena stood up slowly, the muscles in her back protesting the movement. She walked over to the small window above the sink and looked out, seeing nothing but the quiet suburban street outside. The trees in the yard were bare now, the last of the autumn leaves scattered across the ground. She could almost hear her own voice echoing in her mind, reminding her that no matter how hard she tried, how much she sacrificed, Noah had to make his own choices. But this was different. Lena wasn't sure how much longer she could keep pretending the silence wasn't a weight between them. She wasn't sure how many more mornings she could face him with that same hollow smile. She wasn't sure if she was the one who had been silently sacrificing, or if she was just the one who had been silenced. A sharp knock came at the door. Mel's voice followed, louder this time. "Hey, you got a second?" Lena didn't answer immediately. She just kept staring out the window, as though the answer to everything was hidden in the fading daylight. Then, finally, she turned. "I'm coming," she said, the words heavy. The tension hanging between them like an unspoken truth neither of them was ready to face. The sound of the door opening behind her was enough to make her chest tighten. But when she looked up, Mel was already standing in the doorway holding a fresh cup of coffee. For a moment, Lena didn't say anything. She just nodded. "Yeah, I'll be out in a minute." Mel didn't push. She never did. She just left Lena to her thoughts. Thoughts that felt like a storm she could never outrun. But for the first time, Lena wasn't sure if she even wanted to. Lena stood in the small, windowless office of Sunridge's financial aid department, her fingers drumming on the edge of the desk. Mrs. Bennet sat across from her, neat as always, her glasses perched at the tip of her nose, a quiet efficiency in the way she filed papers and shuffled through documents. Lena had been here so many times before, sitting across from Mrs. Bennet, signing forms, providing proof of income, making promises she wasn't sure she could keep, but always did. But today, there was something different in the air. Something heavier, as though the weight of years of decisions, sacrifices, and compromises were finally catching up with her. Mrs. Bennet looked up from the stack of papers, her expression softening when she saw Lena's face. "You know," she began, tapping the edge of a thick folder, "you've been the quietest contributor we've had. This last tuition payment, it's all on you, Lena. Your signature alone covered Noah's gap for the last semester." Lena's heart did a slow, deliberate turn. She had known that was the case, but hearing it out loud, with the words hanging in the air, felt different. All the late nights, all the extra shifts she'd worked in the cafeteria, every drop of sweat and every silent sacrifice had come down to this moment, this last payment that tied her to a future she wasn't sure would ever see her face. Mrs. Bennet continued, flipping the pages with methodical care. "Noah's tuition is fully paid, but for legacy students, well..." She paused, glancing over the paperwork again, her lips pressing together in a thin line. "This year we'll be announcing our legacy sponsors at graduation, a recognition for those who've helped make this place what it is." Lena's stomach twisted. She had never been the type to seek recognition, but she couldn't help but feel a sharp sting in hearing it. Legacy sponsors. Her. The idea of her name being tied to the high-gloss world of Sunridge, to the elite students Noah had begun to distance himself from, felt suffocating. But she knew the truth. She knew how the strings had been pulled behind the scenes, how much she had given to keep his future afloat. Legacy, indeed, but not the kind she had ever wanted. She pulled her gaze away from Mrs. Bennet, the words from that morning still echoing in her mind. "You embarrass me," and a hollow ache spread through her chest. Was this really the future they had worked toward? Was this the price of wanting something better for him? She'd signed everything without question, without expectation, thinking it would be enough. But nothing felt like enough now. The thought of how Noah had always promised, "Someday I'll pay you back," swirled in her mind, the words haunting her like an old melody she couldn't shake off. She could almost hear his voice, the confidence in it, the promise he made with such ease. But the silence that followed each of those promises, the distance that grew between them with each passing year, spoke volumes. "Someday," she muttered under her breath, the bitterness creeping in. Mel's voice rose in her memory, her words blunt and unflinching. He forgot to mention the payback would be silence. Lena blinked as though Mel's voice had broken the thick layer of fog that had settled over her thoughts. She had known it all along, hadn't she? That Noah, with all his ambition and promises, had slowly, quietly erased the debt he owed her. One glance, one snub at a time. There had been no words of thanks, no recognition, no acknowledgement of the years of sacrifice, not even the slightest hint of gratitude. Her hands gripped the edge of the table harder, the ache in her fingers matching the ache in her heart. She slid open the folder in front of her, a routine so familiar it almost felt like muscle memory, and pulled out the stack of papers she had long kept tucked away. As she glanced over them, each receipt, each record, each signature, it all became so clear. The weight of everything, the compromises, the sacrifices, the things she had lost along the way. Lena felt the desire to update her folder, to write in bold letters, "Do not co-sign anything else," but the words sat cold on the tip of her tongue. She wasn't sure what she was afraid of anymore. If she signed it, would it change anything? Or was she simply signing away the last bit of herself in the hopes that Noah would turn out okay? That this sacrifice would somehow be worth it in the end? She closed the folder with a quiet snap, the action final, but the emptiness lingered. Mrs. Bennet, who had been watching Lena closely, seemed to sense the shift in the room. She shuffled the papers again, but there was something softer in her demeanor now, as though she could feel the weight Lena was carrying. "You're a good mother, Lena," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "Noah's going to make something of himself, I'm sure of it. And he'll thank you for it one day, even if he doesn't know how to say it now." Lena couldn't find the strength to respond. She knew better than to hold on to false hope, especially when it came to the things people never said out loud. But then, as if she were trying to lighten the mood, Mrs. Bennet added with a small, knowing smile, "And don't forget, this legacy sponsor business? You'll be getting recognition too. They'll be announcing it at graduation." The room felt smaller. The weight of the words? Heavier. Legacy sponsor. The thought settled in like a stone in her chest, cold and final. Lena stood up slowly, the tension of the moment pulling at her bones. She felt something inside her snap, like a fragile thread that had been stretched too far. "I'll think about it," Lena said, her voice steady, but her eyes distant. She didn't wait for Mrs. Bennet's response. She simply walked out, the papers left on the desk as they had always been, silent, waiting, like everything else in her life. The flyer landed in the mailbox just after noon, wedged between a stack of bills and a catalog for the latest in kitchen appliances. Lena stared at it for a moment before pulling it out. The thin paper too familiar now, the kind that never held good news. She'd seen these flyers before, all those years when she'd come home from the cafeteria with hands sore from hours of serving, only to find Noah's name stamped proudly on every page, an invite to something that always seemed to belong to someone else's world. The cover of the flyer boasted the bold, impersonal text, "Graduation, reserved seating information." Her eyes flicked over the words quickly, skimming past the formalities until she reached the section on reserved seats. There, at the very bottom, was a line printed in black ink, reserved for graduating seniors' family members and special guests. No mention of her. Not even a hint of personalization. Her stomach tightened. She folded the paper carefully and set it down on the table, staring at the empty space beneath Noah's name. She felt a flicker of heat in her chest, something sharp, something that could have been anger or just the cold burn of disappointment. She had been expecting it, hadn't she? But even in her quiet acceptance of what she knew was coming, this omission, still managed to take her breath away. Camille was the first to notice when Lena showed up at the senior breakfast the next morning, eyes slightly too focused on the flyer clenched in her hand. Camille, ever perceptive, leaned over to Lena, her brow furrowed. "You're not sitting in his reserved row?" she asked, her voice laced with confusion, as though this was a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. Lena paused for a moment, her eyes flicking toward the cafeteria's neatly arranged seating chart. The other parents were already starting to trickle in, filling up the front rows where their children sat like perfect little models of success, neat and polished in their ceremony attire. Noah's name was at the very top of the list, reserved in bold letters beside a row of seats draped with gold ribbons. It should have felt like a small victory, shouldn't it? But instead, it felt like a cruel reminder. "Apparently, I'm general admission," Lena said, her voice soft, almost like she was trying not to let the words escape too loudly. Camille's mouth parted, then closed again. Her gaze flicked between the flyer and Lena's calm, composed face, but there was a discomfort there now. Lena could see it, but she couldn't bring herself to respond to it. Camille had never been part of Noah's world, the high society, high-performing, perfect world that had, slowly but surely, pushed her out. But Mel, when Lena returned home later that evening, had no such hesitation. "You can't teach class," Mel said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade, "but you can sure teach dignity." She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her tone carrying that raw, unapologetic edge Lena had come to trust over the years. Lena had heard the words before. They were Mel's mantra, the one she used when Lena doubted herself, when the weight of her choices became too heavy. "Dignity, huh?" Lena said quietly, her gaze fixed on the fading light outside. "Sometimes, I wonder if dignity is just another word for invisible." Mel didn't say anything at first. She didn't need to. She simply pulled Lena's coat from the back of the chair and handed it to her. "You've been doing this longer than anyone ever will understand. Don't let a little thing like a reserved seat make you forget who you are." Lena smiled faintly, though the sting was still there, still sharp in her chest. Mel's words, as always, hit close to the mark. But the real problem, Lena thought, was that the world Mel spoke of, the world where dignity mattered, didn't seem to be the world Noah was inhabiting anymore. She glanced at the clock, realizing that it was already late. The graduation was coming up soon, and there were still things that needed to be done, things she hadn't yet figured out how to address. She turned toward the hallway, walking past the small stack of unopened mail. Her eyes lingered on the folder with the Sunridge logo, the one that contained all the records of what she had paid for, what she had signed, and what she had sacrificed. There was one more thing to do, and she knew it. She opened the drawer with the folder in it, pulling out the envelope she had kept there for weeks. The agreement. Sunridge paper. She took a deep breath and scanned the contents before carefully selecting a few documents to send along. It was simple enough. Just a few receipts. Just a few records of what she had contributed. Nothing that screamed special. Nothing that would make it to the spotlight. But there was one more thing that had to be done. Lena sealed the envelope, her fingers lingering for a moment on the flap. She'd taken too long to address this. Now it was time to speak, even if it wasn't through words. She grabbed her coat and headed out the door, the envelope tucked carefully under her arm. As she walked down the street to Principal Denning's office, the weight of it all pressed down on her like never before. She wasn't sure if this would change anything, if it would change how Noah saw her, or how the school would view the sacrifices she had made, but it was something. Something more than the silence. Something louder than just another invitation that hadn't come. When Lena reached the office, she handed the envelope to the secretary. The weight of it felt almost too heavy to bear. "Make sure it gets to him," Lena said quietly. "Please." She turned and left before anyone could respond, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway, the finality of the moment settling around her like a thick fog. She didn't know if she'd ever get her invitation, but at least she was done waiting for it. The auditorium was alive with the hum of voices, a soft undercurrent of excitement and nerves. Lena sat in the third row, her hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes trained forward as the wave of students and families filled the seats. She felt the weight of the moment without needing to name it. The air thick with the scent of fresh flowers and polished shoes, the muted buzz of eager parents and friends snapping photos. The space was grand, everything shiny and new, a contrast to the quiet ache in her chest. Lena adjusted the folds of her navy dress, the one she'd worn to Noah's 5th-grade promotion, her only attempt at something resembling an outfit for this occasion. It had always been about him, hadn't it? About his success, his future. She wasn't one to seek attention, and this dress, this quiet choice, felt like it fit her role perfectly. In the background, unseen, supporting. She looked down at the program in her hands. The cover, with its gold-embossed lettering, felt too ornate for what she was about to witness. The names in the program were all gleaming and perfect, names that belonged to parents who had always been part of this world, never on the edge of it like her. She didn't expect to be seen, but the uncertainty lodged in her throat was still there, just below the surface. The whispers of students filtered through the room as they took their places on stage, their robes neatly pressed, their faces lit with a combination of pride and anticipation. Lena could see Noah among them, adjusting the collar of his robe with a careful motion, his expression unreadable. He was checking his speech notes, a small frown pulling at the corner of his mouth, lost in his own world. She tried not to let her gaze linger too long on him. He was still her son, the boy who used to cling to her when he was small, but now he felt far away, like someone who had outgrown her without looking back. Camille slipped into the seat beside Lena, her presence a quiet comfort amidst the swelling sea of people. She wasn't part of this world either, but her loyalty was clear, her eyes warm as she offered Lena a small, understanding smile. "You okay?" Camille asked, her voice soft, low enough to be drowned by the murmurs of the crowd. Lena glanced at her, her own smile faint but steady. "Perfect." It was a lie, but it wasn't one that needed to be spoken aloud. Perfect was the last thing she felt. But it was the word she chose to wear tonight, because sometimes perfection wasn't about how you felt, but how you held yourself together. And she was holding it together, piece by piece, as she always had. The overhead lights dimmed, and a hush fell over the crowd. Principal Denning walked to the podium, the old man's stature commanding attention. His glasses glinted under the stage lights as he cleared his throat, the microphone picking up his low, measured voice. "Good evening, parents, students, and guests," he began, his voice steady but filled with the kind of gravitas reserved for moments like this. "We are here to honor the achievements of these young men and women who have worked tirelessly to reach this milestone. And tonight, we begin by honoring those whose names often go unsaid. The quiet supporters who have been there, day after day, making sure these students had the opportunities to succeed." Lena held her breath, her chest tightening as she knew what was coming. The words were slow, deliberate, but she felt the shift in the air as Principal Denning paused, giving the crowd a moment to feel the weight of the statement. She didn't need to look at the program to know what was next. She had already seen it, already read the list of names, but hearing it spoken out loud, seeing it realized, was something she hadn't prepared for. And then, his voice again, deep and resonant, slicing through the silence. Tonight, we begin with one such person, a woman whose sacrifices have shaped the future of these students. Her quiet strength and support have been the foundation on which many of them have built their dreams. The words echoed in the auditorium, filling every corner. Lena felt them hit her chest, a weight she wasn't prepared for. But it was the next words that tore through the air like a gust of wind. The first name on our list, Lena Hawthorne, for 4 years of silent sacrifice and unshakable support. Lena froze, her heart stopping in her chest. For a moment, the entire room seemed to fade away, the world narrowing down to just her name and the weight of it. The words hung in the air for a moment, heavy and thick, before the applause started. It was polite at first, tentative, but soon the sound swelled as others caught on, recognizing what was happening. She didn't stand. She couldn't. She remained seated, her hands frozen in her lap as the applause continued, as Noah's classmates turned to see who had been honored, to see who this mysterious supporter was. She didn't look up at him, but she could feel his gaze on her, even from a distance. She could feel the tension in the room, the unspoken question that hovered just beneath the surface. Why wasn't she standing? She wasn't ready for this. Not for the recognition, not for the eyes on her, not for the way her chest tightened with something that felt like pride mixed with grief, with the harsh recognition of how much she had given up to get to this point. Lena slowly shifted in her seat, her fingers curling into the fabric of the program, and in that moment, she realized something. She had always been in the background. Always. But now it was as though the weight of all those years had been seen, acknowledged, even if it hadn't been in the way she imagined. Still, the applause kept coming. And it wasn't until Principal Denning turned his gaze toward the next name on the list that Lena finally allowed herself to blink, to release the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. But even as the ceremony moved on, she knew with every fiber of her being, that the silence that had lived between her and Noah, that unspoken distance, wasn't finished yet. The words had been said, the recognition had been given, but in the end, it was just her name they had spoken, not his. And that was the part that still hurt the most. The applause for Lena slowly faded, but she didn't move. The weight of the moment, still heavy on her chest, held her in place, her back straight and her hands neatly folded in her lap. The warm light of the auditorium seemed to shine on her without ever touching her skin, as though she were a figure in the background of a painting, invisible but not forgotten. The room felt miles away, yet the clatter of polite applause buzzed in her ears like a distant hum, filling the space in ways she hadn't anticipated. Finally, Lena stood, but only for a moment. The motion was deliberate, measured, a nod of acknowledgement, nothing more. She had never been one for grand gestures, and this felt like one more act of quiet dignity she had been forced into, as if her very presence was a thing she had to earn. The silence that followed her brief rise felt almost louder than the applause. She sat back down with the same slow, deliberate grace, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had settled in her bones. Camille leaned toward her, a whisper breaking the stillness. "That was better than any scholarship speech," Camille said, her voice full of quiet admiration, though her words landed with an edge of sadness. Camille was the one person who saw through the noise, who could recognize the weight behind the gesture, but even she couldn't soften the sharpness of the moment. Lena didn't reply immediately. She didn't have to. Camille's words, though kind, felt like a bitter kind of compliment, a reminder that the recognition she had just received was not the kind she had ever wanted. The applause, the honor, the acknowledgement, they had never been about her. They had always been about Noah, about the future he was supposed to have. She didn't want to be remembered for the things she had sacrificed. She wanted him to remember the sacrifices as his own, to realize that he had the power to build his future on the foundation she had quietly laid. Lena's gaze drifted back to Noah, who was now standing at the edge of the stage with the other students. His shoulders were squared, but his posture was stiff, as though the weight of this moment, this culmination of everything they had worked for, had become too much to bear. His eyes, though forward, didn't seem to notice her. He didn't look toward the audience, and certainly not toward her. He was focused on something else entirely, his future perhaps, or just the urgent need to make it through the next few minutes without appearing too vulnerable. Lena's heart clenched, but she kept her expression neutral, offering no more than a silent acknowledgement of his presence. The other students, as if moved by some unspoken cue, began to rise, their robes rustling, their steps measured. But Noah remained still for just a fraction longer, his expression unreadable. The moment was stretching, the seconds heavy with unspoken things that had never been said, but that she felt anyway. Now, let's begin calling the names of our graduates. Principal Denning's voice rang out once more, and it was as though time shifted, snapping Lena back into the present. Noah's Rao stood as the rest of the auditorium settled into a hushed reverence. She watched him walk across the stage with careful steps, the heels of his shoes clicking against the wooden floor, sharp and precise. His face was set, his gaze locked straight ahead as though there were nothing beyond the path to the podium, nothing except the long road of expectations that lay in front of him. She knew that walk, that tightness in his shoulders, the way his hands were held at his sides like he was carrying something far heavier than the fabric of his graduation robe. He didn't look toward the audience, didn't search the crowd for her, for the one person who had been there all along, building every bridge he would ever walk across. Lena's chest tightened as she saw it, the way he never even turned his head to acknowledge the faces of the people who had gotten him to this point. The truth of it washed over her with an almost painful clarity. He was walking past her, walking past everything she had ever done, as though it was just another day in his journey, and she was a shadow in the distance. Noah reached the podium, and Principal Denning extended his hand. He shook it firmly, the older man's expression a mix of pride and understanding. For just a brief moment their eyes locked, Denning's gaze deep, holding Noah's longer than necessary. Lena couldn't help but notice how the principal's eyes held something more than formality, something that suggested he knew exactly what had been sacrificed in the silence. Noah's hand was already withdrawing, and his eyes were back on the program in front of him. The ceremony continued, but Lena felt the distance between them growing, widening like a canyon that neither of them could cross. In the stillness of the moment, Lena folded her hands tighter around the program in her lap. Her name printed inside, the sponsor page, top line. The irony wasn't lost on her. The name that had carried him all the way here, still not the one that would ever truly be seen. Her fingers grazed the top of the page, and she could feel the weight of what it meant. The fact that this program, this stage, these words, would carry her name for all to see, yet no one would truly understand the story behind it. No one would ever understand the sacrifice that wasn't just silent but invisible. Noah was moving across the stage, the next name called, and Lena, once again, was left behind, not by choice, but by the very fabric of what they had built. She could feel the gap between them growing, the echo of that unspoken truth in her heart, more real now than it had ever been. And yet, she would never say it, because some silences, some truths, were meant to remain unspoken. Lena's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, the screen lighting up in the quiet of the room. She had been avoiding it all morning, feeling its presence without acknowledging it. Now, as the gentle hum of the house surrounded her, she finally glanced at the message. It was from Noah. "I don't know how to say this, but you embarrassed me last night. I thought you understood, but I guess I was wrong. Maybe you should just let me do this on my own." The words hit her like a cold gust of wind, sharp and biting. It was the same as always. The words that weren't really words. The things he said when he wanted to distance himself. She had already been through the unspoken truths, the little gestures of rejection, but this was different. This was deliberate. Lena set the phone down on the counter without replying. The absence of a response felt like a statement all its own, more telling than any words could be. She wasn't angry. No, she had long ago stopped trying to fight for acknowledgement. But she wasn't going to play this game anymore. She had played her part over and over again, never asking for recognition. But this wasn't something she owed him an answer for. Her fingers tightened into fists, a familiar ache rising in her chest. She exhaled slowly, trying to release the tension that had been building for years, the knot that had been forming ever since Noah started pulling away. She stared at the phone for a moment longer, as though she could make the words disappear just by willing it. The quiet ring of the doorbell interrupted her thoughts. She didn't move at first, but then a soft knock came through the door, followed by Mel's voice calling out, "Lena, you here?" Lena walked to the door slowly, wiping the last trace of frustration from her face. When she opened it, Mel was standing there, her posture as straight as ever, a knowing look in her eyes. "Is he still doing this?" Mel asked, her voice low and blunt, as though she were already too tired of hearing the same things. She knew better than to expect an easy answer. Lena didn't answer, not immediately. She turned, stepping back into the house, her gaze still locked on the phone on the counter. "He thinks truth is sabotage," Lena said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mel's words from earlier lingered in her mind, the ones that had hit closer than she cared to admit. She felt the truth of them now in her bones. Mel didn't need any more explanation. She walked past Lena and picked up the phone, studying it for a moment before setting it down gently, as if not to disturb the stillness of the moment. "That's not on you, Lena," she said, her voice firm. "He'll figure it out eventually. He has to." Lena nodded, her eyes drifting toward the kitchen table, where a small stack of papers lay, some of them old, others newer, all containing the story of her quiet contributions. The silence of her sacrifices was printed there in black and white, and she felt a pull toward it. The numbers, the receipts, the signed agreements, they had always been there, tucked away in the back of her mind, but now they felt weightier, more real than ever. "Come on," Mel said, grabbing her jacket and walking toward the door. "I'm taking you out for coffee." No more silence today. Lena didn't argue. She followed Mel out the door, the quiet hum of the house surrounding her as they stepped into the light of the early afternoon. It was easier to be with Mel right now, to feel the presence of someone who understood what it meant to stand alone in the background without ever demanding credit. Later, after the coffee was finished and the familiar chatter had dulled into something comfortable, Lena found herself in front of the Sunridge Financial office again. Mrs. Bennet greeted her with the same calm, professional air, though there was a slight hesitation as if she knew what was coming. "You wanted to review the final record?" Mrs. Bennet asked, handing Lena a thick file of papers. "Everything's there. Every deposit, every payment. You'll have full clarity." Lena flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning each line, each withdrawal, each deposit. The numbers were familiar to her now, their rhythm embedded in her bones after all these years. She had never asked for it to be easy, never expected it to be recognized. But the weight of each payment, each sacrifice, was clear in the rows of numbers staring back at her. She reached the last page where a note had been added. Final payment. Due. 000. A small victory, but one that didn't feel like it had earned her anything. Thank you, Lena said quietly, tucking the folder under her arm. As she stepped out into the sun, the cool breeze brushing against her skin, she felt the familiar sense of isolation creep back in. She knew what came next. This, too, was part of the routine. At home, she reshelved Noah's old science fair trophy, the one he'd won in 6th grade. She didn't need to look at it for long, but she couldn't help but trace the edge of the glass. The boy he had been then, full of potential, full of gratitude, was someone she had never truly let go of. But he wasn't here now. Not in the way she had hoped. Not in the way she had believed he would be. As she placed the trophy back on the shelf, something shifted inside her. Maybe it was the weight of all the years spent waiting for him to see her, to understand her sacrifices. Maybe it was the realization that the waiting would never end. But for the first time in a long time, Lena felt something else. Something softer. Something that could only be described as acceptance. The silence between them had never truly been her burden to bear. It was his. And maybe, just maybe, he would come to understand that in time. But until then, there was no more waiting. Lena closed the door to the room, and the quiet of the house returned once more. Noah stood in the middle of a crowded hallway, his shoulders tight, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. His friends, a tight-knit group of classmates who had spent the last 4 years growing into the type of people who mattered here, hovered around him, waiting for him to speak. The din of voices around them, a mix of students and parents, seemed muffled, like he was underwater, trying to figure out how to breathe. "Man, your mom," one of his friends, Brett, started, his voice a little too loud. "She's like, everywhere. That whole legacy sponsor thing? Weird as hell." Noah's jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything at first. He hadn't wanted to talk about it. Hadn't wanted to admit the source of the discomfort that had been eating at him since the ceremony. But it was too much. Her name, her presence, the fact that she had literally been acknowledged in front of everyone. He'd thought, no one's going to notice, no one's going to care. But they had. "Yeah, well," Noah stammered, trying to sound casual. She kinda, pushed for it, made it weird. A few of his friends laughed, their voices uncomfortable but forcing a nervous chuckle. They didn't understand. They never could. The way his mom had been there, too present, too loud. He wasn't ashamed of the sacrifices she'd made, but damn, the way she'd been put on display? That was something else. He didn't want to be grateful on her terms. It wasn't right. Wasn't how he'd imagined the finish line. He had earned this, not her. Camille was standing nearby, overhearing. She'd been close to Noah for years, his closest friend since middle school, loyal in ways only she could be. But even loyalty had limits. She stepped into the circle, arms crossed, her eyes narrowing on Noah's face. "You mean the part where she literally paid for you to be there?" Camille's voice was low, sharp, a tone Noah didn't know how to respond to. Noah's mouth went dry. He opened his mouth, then shut it, blinking rapidly. "That's not the point." "Oh, it's exactly the point," Camille snapped, her hands going to her hips. "You wouldn't be walking across that stage without her, Noah. She made it possible for you to even be here. And you're acting like you didn't even notice." He winced, her words striking harder than any of the sarcastic comments his friends had thrown at him. They stung, left an ache in his gut that twisted and turned, but he had to stay on top of it. He couldn't let her have that power over him. Not now. "I know that," he said quietly. though the words felt hollow. But it's just weird, all right? I didn't ask for all that. Camille was silent for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as if trying to figure out what he was really trying to say, what was buried underneath the shallow excuse. She stepped forward, her voice softer now, almost gentle, but with the weight of something deeper in it. You didn't ask for her to work every extra shift, Noah. You didn't ask for her to be the one who signed the papers that got you into this school, who kept you here when things were tough. But you sure as hell asked her to make you proud, to get you out of that house and into something more. The words hung between them, a truth so sharp, it cut the air. Noah didn't know how to process it, didn't know how to respond, because, deep down, he knew she was right. The conversation stilled, and the crowd around them seemed to evaporate. His friends were still there, but now it all felt less important. The pressure of the moment, the pressure of the truth, weighed heavier than the laughs or the whispered judgment that would follow. Later that day, as Noah retreated into the quiet of his room, trying to shut out everything, the texts came in. They weren't from his friends, or from anyone who might understand. They came from the people who would always know his mother's worth, whether he did or not. The first one was a thank you card, a simple card, the kind people send after graduations, after weddings. But this one came from a fellow parent at Sunridge, a mother who'd been on the school board. Dear Mrs. Hawthorne, we wanted to extend our deepest thanks to you for your incredible contribution to the scholarship fund. Without your generosity, my child would not be where they are today. You truly make a difference in ways that often go unseen. With gratitude, Sandy Thompson. Noah stared at the card, his stomach churning. It was signed with thanks, with admiration, but it felt hollow to him. His mother had been invisible for so long, but now the truth of her sacrifice was being revealed. It was being seen by people who could never understand how it felt. How it felt to have your mother's face on display when it wasn't wanted, when it wasn't meant for you. He set the card down on the desk, and just then, another piece of paper arrived. It was from Principal Denning. Dear Mrs. Hawthorne, I wanted to take a moment to express my admiration for you. You have led by example, quietly, without seeking recognition. But your presence, your sacrifices, have been more important than any accolade could ever express. Thank you for everything. Sincerely, Principal Denning. Lena had done more than anyone could have ever known. And now, as Noah sat on the edge of his bed, surrounded by the acknowledgments she would never ask for, he felt the sting of her absence in his life, the space that had always been filled with the sound of his own pride, his own achievement. And for the first time, he saw her, not as the person who had embarrassed him, but as the person who had made him, who had fought for every step he'd taken. But it was too late for those words now. He couldn't undo the distance, the years of silence, and he wasn't sure if he ever could. The card, the note, the words. They would never be enough to fill the gap that was growing between them. Noah's hands tightened around the letters as a flood of regret washed over him. But like everything else, this too was his to carry. Lena walked into the college luncheon with the weight of the last few days still pressing on her shoulders. The air was cool, the hum of voices a constant buzz in the background as she entered the reception hall. Long tables were set up, gleaming silverware reflecting the soft light, and clusters of people huddled in polite conversation. It was the kind of event Lena had never belonged to, too polished, too well-heeled. She never expected to be here, let alone at the front of it all. Her eyes scanned the room, familiar faces scattered here and there, each conversation seemingly more important than the last. She was still just a cafeteria worker after all. But something caught her eye. A name. Her name. Printed neatly on the name card at the main table. Lena stopped in her tracks, her breath caught in her chest. She couldn't help but blink, as though the printed words were some kind of trick. But it was there, clear as day. Lena Hawthorne, parent sponsor, Education Equity Fund. Her fingers brushed the edge of the card, the words almost too surreal to believe. How had this happened? She wasn't supposed to be here. Not at the head of the room. Not in this position. Her mind flashed back to the way Noah had distanced himself, how the years of silent sacrifice had been shoved aside, treated like something that didn't matter. This was never meant for her, never supposed to be part of her life. Mrs. Bennet, always composed, stood at the front of the room, greeting attendees with a warm, practiced smile. She caught Lena's eye from across the room and walked toward her, a knowing look in her eyes. "You look surprised," Mrs. Bennet said with a slight chuckle, her voice warm but tinged with something deeper. Lena nodded slowly, the confusion still etched on her face. I don't understand. This isn't my place." Mrs. Bennet gave her a look that wasn't just professional, but understanding, as if she'd expected this reaction all along. "You've been funding more than just tuition, Lena," she said, her voice low but steady. "You've been proving the model works. For these kids, for this institution, they've seen your sacrifices, even if no one ever said it out loud." Lena felt a strange warmth bloom in her chest, but it was quickly followed by a tightening in her throat. The room felt so much bigger now, so much heavier. What had she been doing all these years? She'd never sought recognition. She'd never wanted to be seen in the way she was now. But Mrs. Bennet's words, a quiet, simple acknowledgement, held more weight than any public recognition ever could. A board member who Lena vaguely recognized, a woman with graying hair and a face that looked like it was perpetually in control, stepped up beside Mrs. Bennet. "You must be Lena Hawthorne," the woman said with a smile that was both welcoming and professional. "We've been meaning to meet you." She extended her hand, the gesture businesslike, but not without sincerity. "We've heard so much about your contributions. I'd like to offer you a seat on the scholarship panel." Lena's pulse quickened. This was no longer just a lunch or a polite exchange. This was an invitation to a world she had never thought would open to her. A seat at the table. Her seat. "A seat?" she repeated, her voice more of a breath than a word. The woman nodded, eyes sharp. "Yes, we'd love to have you help us choose future recipients. You've proven that you understand what this process means, what it takes. We could use your insight." Lena looked at her for a long moment, the weight of the offer settling into her bones. She didn't belong here. Not with people who had always lived in this world. People who'd never once asked for anything. But then she thought about Noah. The quiet space between them. Maybe it was time to prove something. To him, to herself. She smiled faintly. "Can I bring coffee to the meetings?" The woman's eyebrows raised, and for the briefest moment Lena thought she'd offended her. But then the woman chuckled softly, her expression softening. "Only if you run one," she said with a wink, a glimmer of humor in her eyes. Lena couldn't help but laugh, the tension in her shoulders easing just a little. This world wasn't hers yet. Not really. But for the first time, it didn't feel as though she were looking in from the outside. Before she could say anything else, her phone buzzed in her pocket. Pulling it out, she saw a text from Mel, a picture of the announcement board. It was a photo of the large printed list of sponsors, and there, at the very top of the page, was Lena Hawthorne, bolded, clear, and undeniable, parent sponsor, Education Equity Fund. Lena stared at the message for a long moment, her breath catching in her throat. She had never asked for recognition, never wanted the spotlight, and yet, here it was, shining on her in ways she hadn't expected, in ways that made her uncomfortable. But as the woman beside her spoke again, introducing her to a few other people at the table. Lena realized something. Maybe it wasn't about her at all. Maybe this recognition wasn't for her. Maybe it was for everyone who had ever been quietly doing the work in the background, pushing others to the front without asking for a thing in return. She glanced down at the table once more, her name staring back at her. It was the first time she'd truly felt seen in a long while, and just as quickly as the thought arrived, Lena pushed it aside. She wasn't done yet. There was still work to do. But for now, this was enough. The phone buzzed again, and this time, Lena didn't even look. She could feel it vibrating on the kitchen counter, a constant reminder of things unsaid, of the silence that had settled between her and Noah. She knew what it was, who it was. No need to check. It was the same message every time, the one she'd been waiting for, the one that would never come. The screen lit up, showing his name once more. She reached for it, paused, then set it back down. Let it ring. Let it go to voicemail like the last few messages had. The weight of the silence settled over her again, a familiar companion now. She didn't need to hear it. She didn't need his words, whatever they might be this time. The voicemail came and went, as it always did. But this time, there was no message, no apology, no question, no nothing. Lena closed her eyes briefly, letting the emptiness wash over her. The absence of sound seemed louder than anything he could have said. There was nothing to fill the space anymore. She had learned, over the years, to let the silence breathe, to let it stretch between them, unspoken, unacknowledged. But each day it grew heavier, harder to ignore. The next morning, she grabbed her apron from the hook by the door, the same worn fabric she'd tied on every day for the past few years. Nothing had changed. Nothing ever did. She was still the cafeteria worker, still the same Lena, standing behind the counter with trays of food she had no part in making, serving kids who didn't know her name. But today, as she walked into the cafeteria, something was different. The students, the ones who had always passed by without a second glance, now nodded as they passed, a quiet acknowledgement in their eyes. It wasn't much, but it was something. A slight shift in the air, as though they were seeing her for the first time. They didn't know her, not really, but they knew something had changed. Something had shifted in the space between them. Lena kept her head down, focusing on the motions of her work, her hands quick as they slid trays along the counter. She wasn't sure if it was the recognition she had received at the luncheon or the fact that Noah's name was still etched in bold letters on that sponsor list, but something had changed, and it wasn't just in the eyes of the students. Camille appeared by her side as usual, her familiar grin lighting up her face. "You're quieter today, Ms. H," she said, her voice low but teasing, as though she could sense the shift in Lena, too. "What's going on?" Lena didn't meet her eyes right away, instead focusing on scooping the mashed potatoes into a tray. She wasn't sure what to say. She had gotten used to keeping her thoughts to herself. The years of listening to others talk about their successes, their recognition, while she remained in the background. But this felt different now. She wasn't sure if she wanted to talk about it, or maybe she just didn't have the words yet. "I'm fine," Lena said simply, the lie slipping out as easily as it always had. She wasn't fine, but there was no use in explaining it. Not yet. Camille leaned in slightly, her tone shifting, softer now. "You're more than lunch, Ms. H." The words hit Lena in a way she wasn't prepared for. She paused, her hands stilling on the tray. For a second, she felt the weight of the unspoken truth between them, the same weight that had lingered for so long, the one that had been pulling at the edges of her heart. She knew Camille meant it, knew she saw her, but it still felt like too much. "So are you," Lena replied, her voice quiet but steady. Camille smiled, that knowing smile as though she knew exactly what Lena meant. "You're part of this place. You always have been." Lena's eyes flicked toward the students who were now filing through the line, their heads up just a little higher than before. The small, subtle changes. They didn't mean much on the surface, but to her, they meant everything. She picked up another tray, trying to lose herself in the motion, in the rhythm of the day. But the truth settled deeper inside her. Quiet but undeniable. She had spent so many years serving in silence, behind the scenes, never asking for anything. Now, the world was beginning to see her, not in the way she had expected, not in the way she had ever wanted, but it was happening. It wasn't just the students' small nods, or the words from Camille, or even the acknowledgement from the school. It was more than that. Noah's name was still out there, still etched into the fabric of everything she had worked for, and it wasn't just her presence in the cafeteria that mattered anymore. It wasn't just her name on the sponsor list. It was that, despite the silence, despite the distance, there was still something she had built that couldn't be erased. Something that was hers. The bell rang, signaling the end of lunch, and the students shuffled out. The noise of the cafeteria faded as the doors opened and closed, and Lena was left alone again, her hands folded neatly on the counter. The phone buzzed again in her pocket. She didn't pick it up. Not yet. The silence between them would remain, for now. But it didn't feel as heavy as it once had. Not anymore. Lena stood in front of the mirror, her fingers smoothing the wrinkles out of the navy dress she had worn to Noah's 5th grade promotion. The fabric was clean now, pressed, the creases sharp as ever. There was something about the way it fit her, the way it had always fit her, that felt like a quiet kind of armor. Not fancy, not showy. Just simple, functional, and the closest thing to a uniform she could wear to these events, without feeling like a stranger in her own life. The reception was being held in a ballroom at the city's finest hotel. She'd never been to an event like this, and certainly never expected to be invited to one as anything more than a silent observer. But here she was, standing at the threshold of a world that was now finally recognizing her contributions in a way she had never expected. It wasn't the way she had imagined, certainly not in the same frame as Noah's name on that sponsor list, but it was something. Something that felt different from the silent sacrifices she had carried for so long. Lena walked through the entrance, the cool air of the ballroom washing over her, the sounds of clinking glasses and quiet laughter filling the space. The room was bustling with students and their families, the glittering lights above casting everything in a soft glow. She found her place among the crowd, her posture still and composed, though the ache in her chest remained. She didn't belong here, not truly, but it seemed no one had told the people around her that. She scanned the room, her eyes landing on Noah, who was surrounded by his classmates. The sight of him felt so distant, as though the years had stretched between them in ways neither of them could bridge. He looked different now, older, more self-assured. But the same tension, the same guardedness, was there. She could see it in the way he held himself, in the way his eyes flickered toward her for the briefest moment before quickly shifting away. He was here, but he wasn't. Lena's gaze dropped as she watched him approach with his friends, and it was only when one of the students from the school leaned in, whispering to another, that she realized just how far things had shifted. "Is that your mom?" the student whispered, loud enough for Lena to hear. "She's kind of a legend here." The words felt like a soft punch to her chest. She didn't need to look up to know that Noah had heard them too. She saw his posture stiffen, his expression shift into something unreadable as he stepped toward her, his classmates trailing behind. The world felt like it slowed down in that moment, the distance between them stretching longer with every step he took. She didn't move, not right away. She couldn't. She wasn't sure what he was going to say, He had been avoiding her ever since graduation, and the tension between them had been gnawing at her. He stopped in front of her, his eyes briefly meeting hers, before looking down at his shoes. An awkward silence settled in the air, thick and uncomfortable. He shifted, his hand brushing the side of his suit jacket as he let out a breath. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but clear. "Thanks. For everything," he said, his words stumbling out, like they had been rehearsed but didn't come naturally. Lena's heart clenched. The words were enough, maybe? They were all she had ever wanted. An acknowledgement, an understanding. But it didn't feel like enough. Not after everything they had been through. Not after all the years of giving him everything she could, expecting nothing in return. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes searching his face, trying to see past the mask of formality he was wearing. "You're welcome," she said, her voice steady, though the weight of everything was pressing down on her chest. She paused, letting the silence linger between them. "But don't confuse visibility with intrusion." His face flushed slightly, a faint red creeping up his neck. He didn't respond immediately, his gaze shifting away from hers, toward his friends, who were awkwardly pretending not to be paying attention. Lena could see it now. The discomfort, the need to keep her at arm's length, to keep his world and hers separate. And yet, in that moment, as Noah glanced away, Lena felt a shift, an understanding, unspoken but there nonetheless. This was the first time he had really seen her. Not as the cafeteria worker, not as the woman who had just made sure he got the education he needed, but as the mother who had spent years building the life he now had. It was the first time he hadn't just accepted her sacrifice as a given. But it was still too late. He stepped back slowly, his words hanging in the air between them, but he didn't linger. He didn't reach for her, didn't try to fix the distance. Instead, he moved away, back into the crowd of students, leaving her standing there, alone, but not unnoticed. Lena took a deep breath and looked around the room. The murmurs of conversation buzzed in her ears, but she was no longer listening. She had learned to accept the distance between them, to accept the silence that had always existed. But there was something different now. She had a place here, at this table, in this world. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. The weight of the evening seemed to settle on her shoulders, but it felt lighter than it ever had before. The truth of what had happened was there, in her hands. And no matter how long it took, Noah would see it. He would understand it. Just not today. Lena looked at the door, then back at the students gathered around her, each face familiar in their own way, yet none of them quite the same as before. She wasn't sure what the future held, but, for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a place in it. She didn't need to be at the center. She never had. But the world was starting to see her in ways she hadn't expected, and that, she thought, was something worth waiting for. The room was quiet except for the soft shuffle of shoes across the floor and the rustle of paper. Lena stood behind the podium, the weight of the moment pressing on her chest like a heavy coat. She hadn't planned on being here, had never even imagined it, but now the spotlight was on her, and the microphone felt heavier than it ever had before. The notes she had scribbled earlier were still folded in her hands, the paper creased from where she had gripped it too tightly. She didn't need them. Not really. She had lived these words every day. She had lived this life. This was just another stage, just another role in the script that had been written for her, without her asking. But now, the words were hers to speak. They had to be. Lena took a slow breath, her fingers steady as she adjusted the microphone. It was a tiny movement, but it felt like the whole world was watching. She could feel the eyes of the students, the parents, the faculty. Everyone who had never once acknowledged her contribution beyond the cafeteria doors, now fixed on her, waiting for her to speak. Her pulse quickened, but she didn't let it show. She was used to being invisible, used to being a quiet presence in the background. But now, in this moment, that silence was gone. The waiting eyes of the room were waiting for something real. She stepped forward, the microphone amplifying every movement, every breath. The notes, still folded in her hands, felt unnecessary. She wasn't here to perform, to make a spectacle. This was truth. Simple, quiet truth. The kind that no one could ignore. "Some of us fund futures from behind serving lines," she said, her voice calm but clear, the words coming out without hesitation. It wasn't a dramatic opening, wasn't some prepared speech meant to dazzle. No, it was just the truth she had lived. The room stayed silent for a beat, and then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the students began to nod. It wasn't applause. Not yet. It was recognition. Understanding. For the first time, they were hearing her, not as the woman who fed them lunch, but as the woman who had made the lunch possible. Her words rippled out into the room, quiet but undeniable. There was no grand flourish, no applause waiting for her at the end. It wasn't about that. It was about being seen, about saying the things that had been buried for so long. She glanced at the students in the front row, their faces familiar but unfamiliar at the same time. They were seeing her now, really seeing her. The room was still and waiting, and then, slowly, something began to change. The student section, those same kids who had once passed her by without a second thought, started to clap. At first, it was slow, hesitant, but then, as though a wave had crashed over them, it grew into something louder, something that filled the room. A standing ovation. For her. The applause wasn't for a meal or a service. It wasn't even for the role she had played behind the scenes. It was for the person she was, for the sacrifices she had made, for the years she had spent invisible, silent, always working for someone else's future. Lena's hands gripped the podium, her chest tight as the sound of applause filled the air, almost too much to bear. It was overwhelming, disorienting. She had never asked for this. She had never wanted it. But now it was here, and she could feel the weight of it, the weight of being seen. From the back of the room, Camille's voice cut through the noise. "You dropped the tray and picked up a room," she said, her voice low but full of pride. Lena didn't look back, but the words echoed in her mind. The shift had happened. She had let go of the trays, the serving lines, and everything that had kept her in the background. And now, she was here. A part of this moment. A part of something that mattered. The applause faded slowly, but Lena's heart continued to pound in her chest. She had expected nothing. Nothing at all. But the weight of the moment, of the standing ovation, had shaken something loose in her, something she hadn't known was still there. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from the moment. She didn't look at it immediately, but when she did, she saw Mel's text. "You dropped the tray and picked up a room." A picture accompanied it, one of the college's Instagram posts, showing the moment she had just experienced. Her face, her name, on the board at the front of the room, right alongside the other names of sponsors and donors. It felt strange to see it there, but it was there, undeniably. Lena smiled faintly, the weight of the moment finally beginning to sink in. For so long she had been unseen, unnoticed. But now she had a place at the table, and it wasn't just a seat she had been given. It was a seat she had earned. But as she stepped back from the podium, the applause still echoing in her ears, Lena knew that something had changed. This wasn't the end. It wasn't the culmination of everything. There was still more work to do, still more silence to break. But for the first time, she was no longer invisible. She had a voice, and she was finally using it. Lena stood in the doorway of the guest room, her fingers brushing over the edge of the bedspread she had just finished smoothing out. The room was neat, the bed freshly made, the curtains pulled back to let the afternoon sun spill in. It looked welcoming, inviting even. But there was something she hadn't touched, something she couldn't bring herself to move. Noah's old trophies sat in a box beside the dresser, their edges worn, the plastic gleaming slightly in the light. She hadn't taken them out. She didn't know why, but they seemed like a relic of a time she couldn't quite touch without feeling the weight of everything that had passed between them. The boy who had once proudly placed them on a shelf had become someone else, someone distant, someone she had struggled to understand. She sighed, her hands resting on the dresser as she took in the quiet. The room was still. The house was still. Everything felt frozen in place. A part of her wanted to go upstairs and find some way to distract herself, but there was nothing left to do. She had cleaned. She had prepared. The visit she had expected to be a long time coming had finally arrived. The doorbell rang, pulling her from her thoughts. It was almost as though the moment had been waiting for that sound, that final piece to fall into place. She took a deep breath before walking down the stairs, her feet light despite the heaviness in her chest. When she opened the door, Noah was standing there, looking out of place. His duffel bag wasn't slung over his shoulder like it usually was when he came home for the summer, and his eyes, usually so guarded, were open, wide with something she couldn't place. He wasn't the confident, collected Noah she'd come to expect. There was nothing left of the arrogance, nothing left of the walls he had built between them. "Hi, Mom," he said quietly, his voice different, softer. He didn't step inside right away, as though unsure how to begin. He was looking at her like he wanted to say something but didn't know where to start. Lena stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. It felt like a dream, like the whole house had shifted, and she was left standing in a reality she wasn't ready for. She took a step back and nodded toward the entryway. "Come in," she said, her voice steady but her heart pounding in her chest. Noah stepped inside slowly, his gaze dropping to the floor. The air between them felt thick, like every word they'd never said was hovering, waiting to fall. He didn't sit down. Instead, he stood in the middle of the living room, his hands jammed in his pockets. "I've been thinking a lot," he said, his voice quiet but with a weight to it. "And I need to ask, was I really that ungrateful?" Lena's breath caught in her throat, the question too heavy to answer in a single breath. She had known he'd been struggling, known that the distance between them hadn't been just about their physical space, but about something deeper, something unspoken. But to hear it from him, this raw, vulnerable question, made everything feel different. She took a slow step toward him, her heart aching with every word she was about to say. "You were scared," she said, her voice gentle. "You were scared because you didn't know how to be grateful for something that felt like a weight. You wanted to belong to somewhere that didn't raise you." Noah's eyes met hers, the hurt clear in the way his jaw tightened. He didn't argue, didn't try to shift the blame or push the responsibility back onto her. Instead, he broke. His shoulders slumped, his breath shaky, and for the first time, he looked like a child again, the walls he'd built around himself crumbling. "I was embarrassed," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I was embarrassed because I didn't think anyone would understand." The words hit her like a wave, crashing over her with a force she hadn't expected. The hurt was there, clear as day, and she could feel the weight of his confession settle between them. But she didn't pull away. She couldn't. Lena stepped forward, reaching out and placing a hand gently on his shoulder. "You didn't need to erase me," she said softly, the words holding more weight than she realized. "You didn't need to push me away, Noah. Just invite me. That's all I ever wanted." For a long moment, Noah didn't say anything. He simply stood there, his face buried in his hands, the weight of everything finally coming undone. Lena stood beside him, her hand still on his shoulder, offering silent support, the kind she had always given but never fully received. She didn't need him to say anything else, didn't need any grand apologies. She had waited so long for him to see her, really see her. And now, in this quiet moment, he finally had. But still, she felt that ache. The ache of all the years spent in silence, of the sacrifices she had made for him to be here, in this room, standing with her. Noah pulled back slowly, wiping his eyes, his face red from the emotions he had kept locked away. He looked at her, his gaze softer now, and for the first time, she saw something else. Something that wasn't just guilt or distance. It was the beginning of something new, something different. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking with the weight of the truth he had just spoken. Lena smiled, a small bittersweet smile, and nodded. "You don't have to apologize," she said, her voice steady, the ache now replaced with something quieter. "You're here now. That's enough." They stood there in the silence, the years of hurt between them still there but no longer as heavy. For the first time in a long while, Lena felt the distance between them begin to close, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe again. But as she looked at him, something else lingered in her mind, a question she hadn't asked herself in years. What comes next? She didn't know the answer, but for the first time, she was willing to find out. The sound of the front door opening echoed through the house, the soft creak of hinges signaling Noah's arrival. Lena didn't look up immediately, her hands still occupied with sorting through the grocery bags, her movements steady and practiced. The weight of the day had already settled into her shoulders, the quiet of the house becoming familiar again, the kind of silence that wrapped around her like an old coat. Comfortable, but never quite comforting. She didn't know why Noah was here. She had been surprised when he'd shown up. No warning, no words exchanged between them since their conversation in the guest room. The visit had been slow to unfold, and now, in this space between them, she wasn't sure what to expect. She heard his footsteps approaching from the hallway and felt his presence before she saw him. He didn't speak at first. He never did when he was unsure, and that silence told her everything. He was waiting for permission, for the space to be. "Mom?" His voice was low, hesitant. He wasn't calling for her like he used to, a demand for attention, but like someone who wasn't sure if he had the right to ask for it anymore. Lena turned slowly, wiping her hands on a towel before setting it aside. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at him. He was standing in the doorway, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, a bag of groceries in his hand like an offering. But it wasn't the groceries that caught her attention. It was the way he stood, tentative, waiting for a signal from her. Noah stepped forward, placing the bag gently on the counter before reaching into his jacket pocket. He didn't say anything for a long moment, his eyes on the ground, avoiding her gaze. Then he pulled out an envelope, a simple, plain envelope, no markings, no signs of importance. But Lena could tell just by looking at it that it wasn't just any letter. This was something he had thought about, something he had worked on. I don't know if this fixes anything," Noah said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. He handed her the envelope, his fingers barely touching hers. "But I think you deserve to know I finally get it. The cost." Lena didn't take the letter right away. She stood there holding her breath, waiting for the rest of the words to spill out. They didn't come. There was only the soft rustling of paper as he let go and took a step back, his eyes now meeting hers, clear, unguarded, and vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen in years. He didn't apologize with grand gestures or performative words. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply offered her this piece of himself, wrapped in ink and paper, the weight of years written in every word. Lena slowly took the envelope from his hands. Her fingers felt the rough edge of the paper, the faintest impression of the writing inside. She didn't open it immediately. She didn't need to. This moment, this quiet exchange, was more than any words written on a page could ever convey. "I'll read it," she said finally, her voice soft, steady. But she didn't open it right then. She placed it gently on the kitchen table between them, like it was a relic of something that had finally found its place. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Lena took a deep breath, steadying herself. She wasn't sure what this meant yet. She wasn't sure if it would change everything, or if it would just be another moment, another brief exchange before the silence returned. But she didn't feel the same weight in the air as she had before. Noah, unsure of the next step, reached for the bag of groceries, starting to unpack it with the same mechanical precision that she had always seen in him. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't everything, but it was something. It was a step forward, even if it was small. Lena watched him for a moment, her heart still tight. She didn't expect anything grand from him. She didn't expect him to suddenly get it, to suddenly see everything through her eyes. But there was something in the way he moved, the way he didn't hide from her anymore. It was different. She turned back to the envelope, her fingers running along the edge of the paper. She didn't need to read it all to know what it meant. What Noah had given her wasn't just an apology, it was a shift. He was trying. That was enough for now. Lena opened the letter slowly, the words inside just as carefully chosen as she imagined. They weren't a grand declaration, but they didn't need to be. They were simple truths, things she had always known, but now they were finally being said. She read through the first few lines, the words quiet but true. "I've spent so much time thinking about everything I didn't see, about the sacrifices you made without a word, the things I took for granted, the ways I pushed you away. And I'm sorry. I didn't understand. But I do now. I see you. And I get it. The cost. And I'm sorry I couldn't see it before." Lena's eyes blurred, but she didn't cry. She couldn't. This wasn't about sorrow anymore. This was about understanding, about moving beyond the hurt. She folded the letter back up slowly and tucked it into the drawer beside her. "Keep showing up," Lena said quietly, her voice steady, her words simple but heavy with meaning. "That's repayment enough." Noah nodded, and for the first time in a long time he looked at her like he meant it, like he had finally seen everything she had given, everything she had been. And in that moment there was something new between them, something that couldn't be undone. Lena watched him turn and move toward the door, the tension between them dissipating with every step he took. The world outside had shifted, but it was up to them to figure out where to go next. For now, she had everything she needed. The rest would come. Slowly, but it would come. Lena stood in front of the campus, the warm autumn sun casting long shadows across the quad. She had never imagined herself walking these paths, never thought she would be the one whose name would be carved into the very stone that held so many other legacies. But here she was, standing before the plaque that now bore her name, framed and lit, immortalized as if her sacrifices could somehow be distilled into these few words: Lena Hawthorne, quiet provider, unshakable foundation. The words were simple, but they felt like a weight. She had always been the quiet one, always in the background, never seeking attention or recognition. Yet here it was, in stark contrast to everything she had ever known. Her name, lit up like a monument, a testament to a job that was always invisible. She stood there for a moment, just looking at it, the soft glow of the lights reflecting off the plaque. There was something about seeing her name in this place, this sacred, high-achieving place, that made her feel both small and larger than life. The juxtaposition of it all struck her. She had never been part of this world, had never asked for a part in it. But now, she was here, and for the first time, it felt like a quiet victory. The campus bustled around her, students walking by with their heads down, unaware of the woman who stood there reading the plaque. But some of them glanced over, their eyes lingering just a little longer than usual. She caught the whispers as they passed. That's the one. She's the one who made it happen. Lena felt the weight of it in her chest. These soft acknowledgments, the way her name lingered on their lips. It wasn't about her anymore. It wasn't about her legacy. It was about them, the kids who would walk these halls because of her sacrifices, the kids who would see her name here and know that there had been someone quietly working behind the scenes to give them this future. A younger student walked past, glancing at the plaque before turning to her. His eyes widened when he saw her standing there, almost unsure of whether to approach. His voice was soft, almost hesitant. "Are you her?" he asked, his voice filled with awe. Lena turned, her heart still a little heavy from the realization that her presence here was not something she had asked for, but something that had happened despite her. She smiled gently, the recognition still new to her. "Just visiting," she said, her voice steady but warm. It was the truth. She wasn't part of this world, not really. She had never intended to be. But today, standing in front of the plaque with her name on it, she could finally admit that maybe, just maybe, she belonged here too. The student nodded and walked away, a little faster now, as though he was carrying the weight of seeing someone who had been here all along, waiting, working without expectation. He wasn't the first one to notice, and he wouldn't be the last. Lena sat down on the bench nearby, her fingers brushing the surface of the wooden slats. It was quiet now, the sounds of students fading into the background as she let herself breathe. There were no more grand speeches, no more loud proclamations. She had made her impact quietly, in the shadows, and that was enough. Just then Camille appeared, coffee cup in hand, looking every bit as composed as always. She smiled as she sat next to Lena, her eyes briefly scanning the plaque before turning to her friend. "This isn't just about him anymore," Lena said, her voice quiet but sure. "This is about every kid who thinks love is loud." Camille didn't respond right away. She just took a sip from her cup, letting the words settle between them. She could hear the truth in Lena's voice, the change that had shifted between them over the years. Lena had spent so much of her life in the background, in the silence, watching others take center stage. But now, she had taken that stage for herself. Not loudly, but firmly. Lena's eyes followed a group of students who passed by, their heads down, lost in their own world. They hadn't noticed her. But maybe that didn't matter anymore. She wasn't looking for recognition. She had given enough for the people around her, and now it was time to just be. "Do you think they'll remember?" Lena asked suddenly, her eyes still watching the students. Camille smiled softly, a knowing smile. "They already do." Lena nodded slowly, the thought settling in. They would remember, even if not everyone saw it right away. And in the end, that was enough. She took a deep breath, the weight of everything finally beginning to ease. This wasn't the end, but it felt like a turning point, a moment where she could look forward, not back. The future was still uncertain, still waiting to unfold. But for the first time in a long time, Lena felt ready to face it. The plaque, her name, the quiet understanding from the students. It was all part of something bigger now. Something that had been built over time, with care, and without asking for anything in return. The wind picked up slightly, ruffling her hair. But she didn't mind. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she was finally walking in the right direction. As Camille leaned back on the bench beside her, Lena glanced down at the campus, at the students, at the future she had helped to shape. She didn't need the recognition, didn't need the spotlight, but it was here, and for once, it felt like enough. The stadium was buzzing with the electric hum of excitement, but Lena sat still, her hands folded gently in her lap. The noise of the crowd was distant to her, muffled by the overwhelming sense of calm that had settled over her. She was no longer the woman in the background, no longer the silent worker behind the scenes. Here, in the front section, her seat was reserved, just as her place had been all along, even if she had never truly realized it until now. The rows around her filled with proud families, some faces familiar, others unknown, but Lena's attention was elsewhere. She looked down at the program, her fingers lightly tracing the words on the page, the familiar names printed beside each graduate. She had done this for 4 years, quietly building the foundation of their futures. But today, she was part of it in a way that felt right. Her name was on the legacy recognition list, right there alongside the students she had helped shape. Her heart swelled as the moment neared. There was no need for words today, no need to shout her pride. The journey had been long and quiet, and this was her moment of peace. Her son had made it. They both had. As the ceremony proceeded, the names of the graduates were called out one by one, the students walking across the stage, their faces a mixture of nerves and pride. It felt like an eternity before Noah's name was called, but when it finally came, everything inside Lena stilled. Noah Hawthorne, the announcer's voice rang out, clear and bright, carrying through the stadium. Lena didn't have to look far. He stood, his dark suit a sharp contrast against the sea of caps and gowns. His walk was confident, his shoulders squared in a way that told her he had grown into himself in ways she had longed to see. She had always known he was capable. But this moment, this public acknowledgement of his success, felt like a gift she had never asked for. He reached the podium, shaking the hand of the principal with a quick smile, his eyes not lingering on the crowd. Lena saw it, that glimmer of recognition, that flicker of connection between them. It was as though everything had come to this point, a point she never thought would come. And then, as Noah stepped down from the stage, as the next name was called, something unexpected happened. He turned. Not just to the next graduate, not to the other families seated around the hall. He turned directly toward her. The movement was subtle, barely noticeable to anyone else in the crowd. But to Lena, it felt like a shift, like something breaking through the years of silence between them. He found her in the crowd, his eyes scanning the rows until they locked with hers. In that moment, Lena saw everything she had hoped for. A small act of acknowledgement, a quiet thank you. He didn't shout. He didn't run toward her. Instead, he did something that meant more than anything. He mouthed 2 words, "Thank you." Her heart clenched, but she didn't cry. She didn't need to. The moment felt like it had been coming for years, and in that instant, she knew it wasn't about the words. It was about finally being seen. Not as a provider, not as someone behind the scenes, but as someone who had shaped this moment, who had made this day possible. Lena nodded, a small, silent acknowledgement of everything that had passed between them. The years of giving, the years of waiting, the years of hoping. She didn't need to say anything. She didn't need to explain. This moment, this simple, quiet exchange, was enough. As Noah walked off the stage, the applause grew louder, the sounds of his classmates and their families filling the air. Lena remained seated, her hands still in her lap, feeling no need to rise. She was already standing in that moment, already a part of the crowd in ways she hadn't expected. And then, as if to seal the weight of it all, the screen above flashed. Legacy recognition, Lena Hawthorne. The words illuminated the giant screen above. Her name, her legacy, for everyone to see. The applause grew, but it was different now. It wasn't just for a student. It wasn't just for the future of those who would walk across the stage today. It was for the woman who had helped make it happen. For the quiet provider who had built the foundation on which these futures stood. Lena sat back in her seat, her chest full, her heart lighter than it had been in years. She wasn't just here as Noah's mother. She was here as a part of this institution, a part of this success. As the ceremony moved forward, Lena allowed herself to watch the students filing off the stage, each of them leaving behind their own mark. But for her, this moment, the moment where Noah had looked for her in the crowd, where he had acknowledged her in front of everyone, was the one that would last. The one that would finally erase the silence between them. My son said, "You embarrass me," Lena thought, her chest tight but full of pride. At graduation, the announcement spoke my name first, and for the first time, Lena felt the full weight of everything she had quietly built, everything she had given. It wasn't just her son who had made it. They both had, and that was enough.